Okay. Alrighty, there we go. Takes a second. Crud. Okay. Okay, so a couple questions. Yes, the stream is up now. Just a little slow. When does Gen Alpha start? It seems like Gen Z is really short compared to the rest. Yeah, so this is an interesting question. This one, yes, okay. I have tended to always want to put the start of Gen Z around 1996, 1997, but you're right. One of the things that Jean Twenge talks about in her book, iGen, is that she thinks that generations increasingly are driven, oops, what? Oh, okay, weird. There we go. Generations and the kind of start and end dates of generations are increasingly driven by technology. So she thinks the generational cohorts that we see are getting shorter and shorter because technological change is getting more and more rapid. Okay. Do you need to know the dates? No. I want to ask you the dates. Okay. Right. So we ended off here on Monday. Oh, by the way, happy Valentine's Day. Also, if you're Catholic, it's Ash Wednesday, so you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Okay, so we talked about re-socialization, right, as a process, right? So obviously we're all socialized in different ways throughout our lives, but there are specific moments and specific kind of institutional settings, especially very powerful ones that cut us off from other ties that we have, that may lead to us being re-socialized, right? Or basically, essentially dropping previous social norms that we had and adapting to completely new values, roles, self-conception, because you don't really have a choice. Okay, so one of the really common ones here, and we'll talk about prisons, because prisons are what are called total institutions. Prisons often cause a re-socialization, right? Because when you go to prison, suddenly all of these social ties that you had before, your family, your friends, are mostly cut off, right? Like you still may get to visit them or hear from them, but mostly you are out of contact with them. And suddenly you're thrown into a totally new social circumstance with totally different rules. And you have to adapt to that very, very quickly, or you will not succeed, right? You will get into a lot of trouble. So the other one is cults, right? New religious movements, particularly the more abusive ones, right? They have a sort of technique of isolating people from friends and families, specifically so that they can reshape them, right? And so when you join a cult, please never do that, you will ultimately be re-socialized really quickly, right? You'll be taught new values, new norms, a new self-concept, so that they can control you through that. Okay. Okay, often re-socialization or lots of different things in life will happen through an initiation ritual of sorts. Right, so there's lots of different kinds of initiation rituals. They aren't all to do with re-socialization. Some of them are. But initiation rituals are another kind of form of socialization and are generally used in order to split you from your old life and connect you into some kind of new life that you are supposed to be living, right? So basically, it's supposed to be, a transition from one part of life to another. Okay, so initiation rites, as opposed to, say, rites of passage, generally have a couple of similar kind of ways of doing things, right? Or a couple of similar kind of pathways. So typically, they will involve a rejection of your old life, right? In most rites, initiation rites, you have to reject your old life in some way. You go through a sort of ritual death and then a ritual rebirth, right? Now, in like completely Western and kind of Western Christian terms, I guess in Eastern Christianity is the same, this is a pretty recognizable thing. especially if you go back to the kind of the early days of say, Christianity, right? So if you went back to the early days of Christianity, right, when Christianity was taking over from, say, the pagan religions of the Roman Empire, one of the things that happened when you became Christian, at Easter typically, was that you would go through you would be baptized, right? And baptism is a rite of initiation, right? So what would happen, right? Right. Okay, don't say right so much. So what would happen, right? So you would be brought to the baptistry, right? Wherever, it was basically a pool, where you would strip completely naked, right? You don't do this anymore, thank God. But you would strip completely naked, and enter the baptistry, right? So like what's pictured in this slide is like a representation of kind of baptism in the early Christian churches. And you would, as a ritual rejection, you would turn to the west and you would spit, right? And that was a rejection of the old gods that you had previously been attendant to, right? So if you were a Christian, right, you are rejecting the gods of paganism, the traditional Roman gods, the Zeuses and the, all that stuff. So you were rejecting those gods by spitting to the west, and then you would turn to the east in the baptistry and you would undergo a ritual death, right? So you would be submerged completely in the water, right? To signify kind of ritual drowning. And then you're brought back up, in a ritual rebirth out of the water into new life, right? This probably symbolizes like coming out of the womb again into a new life, right? Now, okay, that's a very religious kind of way of thinking about it. We see similar rites of initiation or initiation rites in other kind of places, right? Criminal gangs will often do these sorts of initiation rituals as well. So things like, the Hell's Angels, right? If you want to become a Hell's Angel, right, you have to kind of do the same thing, right? A ritual rejection is you have to commit a crime, right? So you have to show through the act of committing, a felony, can't be a misdemeanor, has to be a felony, that you are rejecting your ties to the outside world and entering the Hell's Angel as your sort of new family, right? So you are now, totally at odds with society because you've now committed a crime. You go through a sort of ritual death, right? Typically the stripping off of like your old biker jacket, one that didn't have the patches on it, and a ritual rebirth where you receive your full patch biker jacket, right? Different gangs will do this differently, right? Street gangs also have initiation rites that also follow a lot of these same kinds of patterns. It might not be 100% exact, but that's the typical pattern that it tends to follow. Okay. Okay, I just want to... If only. That would be fun. There was another phrase a couple of semesters ago that I would say a lot. And you probably would pick it out if I said it. I just can't remember what it was. And my students used to actively make fun of me about it. It was a good time. They all failed. No, I'm kidding. They're fine. Okay, so total institutions, which I mentioned a second ago, right? Total institutions basically are institutional settings where people are essentially taken out of society, right, and isolated and put under the strict control and constant supervision of specialized staff, right? So prisons are probably the most recognizable total institution. But what's really important about them is that they can broadly cause you to change your norms in major ways, right? Because again, suddenly you're cut off from the world you knew, you're cut off from most, if not all, of your existing social ties, and you become suddenly extremely malleable, right? And you have to take on all sorts of new roles, right? Like if you go to prison, you suddenly have to learn how to deal with correctional officers, right? Who have an enormous amount of power over you, right? You are now completely under their control. See, now I feel self-conscious about what I say. So, same with cults, right? Suddenly you're cut off, and usually you're going to be under like the spiritual direction of some specialized member of their staff that's working to reshape your identity. Now, this is what this picture is, right? This is from, the very famous Stanford prison experiment. And I hesitate ever to use Stanford prison experiment as an example, because we have pretty good evidence now that the whole thing was kind of a hoax and it was rigged. But very famously, right, the Stanford prison experiment at Stanford University, they asked for volunteers to participate in an experiment where they, assigned people to be either a guard or a prisoner in a kind of fake prison. And they basically wanted to see what kind of roles people would adopt. And they found that people, those assigned to be guards, very quickly became kind of abusive and used their power over the other people. And then, the people assigned prisoners, some of whom reported then trauma, assume the roles of prisoners in very particular ways. Now, I do want to say it's been held up as an example of what happens in total institutions, but we have a lot of really cool prison research of what happens in actual prisons, so we don't need to think too much about it. I will say there's pretty good evidence now that the people running the Stanford prison experiment rigged it and basically told, both the people playing prisoners and the people playing guards how they wanted them to act. And this has come out from testimony from the people who actually participated. Okay, so that's total institutions. Anticipatory socialization is another form of socialization that sometimes people will play, right? And sometimes people will do in order typically to try and get ahead of some kind of change that's going to happen in their life, right? You start to, essentially, anticipatory socialization is all about trying to take on the roles, take on the affects, take on the social roles of some position to which you aspire, right? And basically it's all about trying to learn the role before you actually step into it, right? So this is like, sometimes you might hear a phrase like, don't dress for the job you have, dress for the job you want. That's a form of anticipatory socialization, right? A way of preparing yourself for a role that you want in the now, right? So instead, sorry, God damn it. I said right twice in the last 2 minutes. It's just verbal garbage that I throw out, like and hey and, concomitantly. Now I'm being self-conscious about it. So, right, okay, left. I'm going to say left from now on. He's good, right? Okay, let's try that again. Essentially, we are always trying to learn new roles, right? When you're, about to become a parent, right? Be less self-conscious. I'm sorry for swearing. When you notice your own verbal tics, it's very irritating. And when you talk for a living, you talk a lot, and sometimes you pick up on particular things, and it changes from month to month, week to week, year to year. But it can be very annoying when you realize it, and you don't it's so beyond even conscious thought. I don't even know what I was saying anymore. Because now I'm just being all self-conscious, right? Yeah, I did that one on purpose, I'll tell you that much. Okay, when you're going to become a parent, you often will, take parenting classes, look at parenting books, hang out with other parents, seek out the guidance of other parents so that you learn what that role looks like. I remember when my wife and I were having our first child, we went to parenting groups of people who were also about to have, a child, and some of them had previous children, some of them were having their first child as well. So we were trying to get a handle on, okay, what was this new role going to be like? What does it look like to be a parent? We started hanging out with our friends who already had children, so that we, I'm holding it back so hard. I'm so conscious about saying it. Trying to anticipate what that role would be. My parents started to do the same things when we were having kids, right? Hanging out with grandparents and talking with my aunts and uncles who already had grandkids, trying to figure out what this process looked like. We do this all the time, right? We're trying to learn the roles, and sometimes you sort of pick it up before the role actually comes so that you're better prepared, you know the norms, you know what you're supposed to do when that actual change comes. So, key thing with socialization to remember, like even in adulthood, right? Once you're an adult, you're still changing and you're still being socialized. We tend to think of socialization often as something that happens just in childhood. But as we move through life, you are going to continue to, your self-image, who you are, is going to continue to change and evolve, even if sometimes we're not aware of it, right? We tend to think of the self as a really stable, constant thing. You've been the same since you were a kid, but you've actually been changing the whole time, right? Your identity. I knew I was going to laugh, and that's why I swore. You're constantly changing, constantly taking in new inputs, constantly moving from one phase of life to the next. Other things, right, that may ultimately allow us to reshape who we are and that are reshaping who we are, things like globalization, which we'll talk about at some point. Global inputs of culture, norms, foods, and all sorts of things that we may be kind of adopting as very important to us and changing our identities around. And then, the increasing ability to actually change our physical forms, right? Through things like cosmetic surgery, right? Cosmetic surgery allowing us to reshape our identities, especially in an anticipatory way, to move towards, say, a more cultural beauty standard, to basically become kind of new. The fact that everybody gets like, I don't know if they're true. I see these videos of people online who got like lip filler to appear more like the whatever current cultural beauty standard is, and they end up looking like a puffed up blowfish, but that's neither here nor there. That's a sort of anticipatory socialization. You're moving towards a certain beauty norm, right? When people get a nose job or a tummy tuck or a boob job or something like that, right? It's a sort of anticipatory socialization trying to conform to what they perceive of as the cultural beauty standards. Now, if only they could figure out a way to regrow hair, I would be all for that. Okay. I miss hair. I haven't said right in like 5 minutes. I think I'm doing good. Okay. Now I just said okay. Digital technologies. Another kind of way that increasingly we see people being socialized is through digital technologies, and specifically, the possibility of adopting particular identities online. And I told you about my friend Kelly, who wrote, I think, the best titled academic paper in history, Big-Breasted Night Elves and the Men Who Love to Play as Them, which I still will never write a journal article title as good as that one. That is the best. Online technologies allow us to reshape our norms, our values, and draw on norms and values from, say, other racial groups, other genders, and create these online identities using, avatars. I know World of Warcraft is really old now. I actually don't know if anyone even still plays World of Warcraft. But there are all these games around all the time that allow us to take on other identities and try out different roles and see how people are treated in different kinds of settings, and essentially socialize ourselves with different kinds of norms that we couldn't in the real world because they don't match our bodies. Okay. I didn't clear that. I should have. It's such a mean no, I'm kidding. I don't mind. It's funny. When I say words too often, it's funny. Okay. All right, that's the last slide for that particular unit. Okay, let me these are comments from last year. They were funny. Okay, let's talk a little bit about deviance and crime. That should take us to the end. Deviance and crime is a bit of a long unit, so it probably will take us until after reading week to get all the way through it. New Slido. Man, my hand is tingly and numb. That's probably not a good thing. Oh, that was from last term. Hang on a sec. I'm remember, is globalization next or deviance? I don't know. I can't remember. Okay, hang on. I'll clear those comments. Okay. Let's go. There we go. Okay, I will say, I think I had about 15 or so people come by to see their exams yesterday. I won't be on campus tomorrow, but Friday, if you want to come after class, I will be in my office from like 1 o'clock until about 3:30. Could I give an example of a ritual death for a normal activity? Interesting question. No. Because, sorry, and it's not that I don't want to, right? It's not that I don't want to. It's that when you're talking about an initiation rite, that one doesn't count. An initiation rite, it isn't a normal activity. These are, oh cool, I didn't know it was still a thing. Initiation rites inherently are special moments in life, and they do not happen very often. They only happen when you are being brought into some kind of new phase of life, or you're actively rejecting some kind of past identity, being brought into a new identity. So they are joining a new group, especially a really powerful one. So they are really quite rare, right? They don't happen a lot of times. So there isn't really a normal activity that you would find an initiation rite. Not in the sense that you're, joining, say, I don't know, because now I'm thinking World of Warcraft, joining a guild in World of Warcraft, there might be a sort of rite of passage in there, but it's rarely as epochal a change for you as a person as, say, joining a new religion, right? Or joining like a cult or a gang or something like that. So I would say for the most part, I can't really think of a regular activity or a normal activity because a rite of initiation isn't a normal part of everyday life. Okay. Cool. World of Warcraft. It was fun. I played it a little bit, but I don't anymore because I have no time. Now I only play Rocket League. Okay. So, deviance and crime, and this is always a kind of interesting and fun kind of unit. So we were just talking about norms, when we talked about culture. So deviance, really, when we talk about deviance, you're really, any kind of act that we talk about as deviant is essentially something that goes against or violates some kind of social norm. So that is what deviance is. It is just any action a person takes that violates a social norm. So me standing up here, during a lecture where I'm supposed to be the erudite professor and occasionally dropping a few F-bombs because I can't stop saying the word right, that's a kind of minor form of deviance because professors probably shouldn't swear, and yet it's kind of funny, so whatever, right? Did it again. Okay, I'm okay. I didn't swear that time. I'm good. I need food. That's what I need. So, deviance, right? Oh, so self-conscious. Never talk for a living. Have a job where you don't have to talk to anyone ever. It'll be the best. I love my job. Just today I'm being weird. So, norms. And what is therefore deviant, it's relative, right? There is no act in society that in and of itself is deviant. Because in one place, something might be deviant. In another place, it might be perfectly acceptable. Even things that we think of as, pretty central to, say, our society, in a lot of other places, they might be held as perfectly normal. So, polygamy. Polygamy is not seen as a good thing in Western societies as a whole. It would be seen as deviant if you have multiple, spouses. However, in a lot of other places in the world, and historically, polygamy not seen as any kind of problem, seen as very normative, right? It is within the realm of norms. So from a sociological perspective, we can identify what is a norm and what is deviance within a particular cultural setting. But there is no act, from a sociological perspective, that is deviant in and of itself. It's all relative, right? It's all relative to place, time, and the social norms of a particular location and moment in history. And again, things that might have been, the norm 50 years ago, things that would have been perfectly socially acceptable, certain, for example, racial epithets, right? Using certain words to describe certain racial groups. For my dad's generation, it would have been perfectly okay. If you said it today, right, now you're deviant, you're violating a kind of social norm. So all of these things are relative to time and place from a sociological perspective. And yeah, everybody is deviant in one social context or another. Everybody has certain beliefs, certain actions that are deviant in some way, right? There's no individual that follows every single social norm all the time. It is basically impossible. Okay, so deviance. Deviance occurs when someone departs from a norm and evokes a negative reaction from others. So if a person is in the woods and is deviant and nobody sees it, is it deviant? By this definition, it is not, right? Deviance only occurs within a social context. So, if you do something that is deviant, you get a negative reaction, right? You say something, I don't know, you use a bad word, and you get a reaction from people. Your grandma looks at you funny. Your mom's like, don't say that, that's not polite. Then you're in the realm of deviance because it's established in that kind of social context. Crime is just deviance that breaks a law. So we talk about the difference between deviance, just plain out deviance, and crime. Again, it's socially contextual. Things that are a crime in one place might not be a crime in another. But a crime is just a form of deviance that breaks a law. And laws, right, are the norms stipulated and enforced by government bodies. They differ widely, again, place, time, and all of that stuff. I like this fish. His deviance makes me happy. Okay, so people who are observed committing acts of deviance will face different kinds of levels of punishment. The more serious the social perception of that deviance, the more likely you are to face harsher punishments. And you can class punishments into essentially two categories. You've got the informal and the formal. Informal punishments essentially are things that happen in a kind of microstructure, in an interpersonal context, that are typically, face-to-face. So, I'm trying to think of an example. I'm trying to think of example because I have a whole bunch of hair-based examples coming up, and I'm trying to think of examples that don't have to do with hair. Let's say you are driving and you cut someone off in traffic, right? They honk at you, they drive beside you, they give you the finger. You've essentially done something deviant, right? Because you've violated the norms of good conduct on the road, and you get a sort of informal punishment, right? You're made to feel bad by the other driver. They honk at you, they scare you, they give you the finger, they make, they do that thing where you drive by the person you're not happy with and you look at them as you drive by, you scowl at them so they know, and they desperately try to just look straight ahead so they don't have to make eye contact. You're in the realm of, we've all done it, you're in the realm of informal punishment there. You're in the realm of, you violated some kind of norm, you get some kind of informal punishment. You cut in line at Tim Hortons, right? You're going for your Tim Hortons after class or before this class because Professor Broussard puts you to sleep every time and you need a coffee to make it through, but you're late, so you jump in line in front of someone else and they start screaming at you because everybody needs their Tim Hortons coffee immediately. That's an informal kind of punishment. Okay, a formal punishment obviously takes place in a more formal context. Now, it can, typically we think of it as the judicial system, but any kind of institutional system can have a sort of formal punishment. So let's say that you break the law, right? You steal someone's car, hopefully not, but maybe. You steal someone's car, you'll go to jail, right? That's a formal punishment through the judicial system, or you steal something, or whatever it happens to be. That's a kind of formal punishment. There can be formal punishments outside of the judicial system as well. For example, if you cheat on an exam and you get caught, you're not going to go to prison, because we don't do that yet. Lobbying for it. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. You don't go to prison, but you will probably be hauled to the dean's office, and you will be told, maybe you're given a failing grade in the class, or forced to withdraw, or suspended, or whatever it happens to be. Formal punishments basically take place within, macro structures, whether it's the judicial system, the university, school, your employer, where there is a formal process. So, and yeah, it can be breaking, either a law or violating, mores. Both can engender sort of formal punishments. Okay. I love this ad so much. Just to illustrate how much norms change over time. This is an ad from the hearty year 1885 for cocaine toothache drops. Oh, I love it. And, Lloyd Manufacturing Company, they even tell you the address, of 219 Hudson Ave, Albany, New York, is offering these cocaine-based toothache drops for children. Oh, I love it. Just to show you how much norms change over time. Now, obviously, I suspect this norm kind of changed over time because we learned what cocaine does and that children probably shouldn't, take drugs. Probably a bad thing. But if you went back to 1885, giving cocaine to children was apparently not seen as a bad thing. Right? And very famously, Coca-Cola, which is developed kind of in the same era, originally is a headache tonic, and it contains cocaine as well, which is why it's called Coca-Cola. And weirdly, and I only found this out a couple of years ago, Coca-Cola still imports coca leaves. It's the only company in the US that's legally allowed to import coca leaves, and it goes through a process to remove all the fun drug stuff from it. Not that drugs are fun, drugs are bad. Okay? Sorry, little South Park reference for you. But they're still allowed to import it and use the flavor parts of the coca leaf, apparently. Very closely regulated by the US government. But yeah, Coke still contains, coca leaves. That's fun. Thank you for counting. That's great, right? Ha! Now you have to change it. It's right to say the right. I can't finish the sentence. Nope, I got nothing. Please write down some notes where I said the right thing about rights. There we go. Boost them all up. So would informal punishments occur more in microstructures? Yeah, typically informal punishments happen through microstructures. They're more in face-to-face interactions, so they do happen more in microstructures. Typically, macrostructures have more formal processes. They can still have informal punishments, right? Maybe you just get kicked out of class or something by the professor. So that's still technically kind of on the border between a micro and macro structure. But yeah, informal punishments more typically happen in the microstructure realm. I always think of it as your grandma. Okay, so deviance and crime vary in terms of 3 criteria. So the severity of the social response. And this, it's complicated when you talk about deviance and how it is punished, because even things that, in any other context might seem relatively inoffensive can elicit a very serious social response. And when I talk about my pyramid of stupid hair-based crimes, which all the examples are about hair, clearly I'm compensating for something. You can get very serious consequences or social responses to what might seem like very, very trivial violations of norms. The perceived harmfulness is also important. How harmful does a society ultimately see a particular transgression? That is going to, set the level of deviance and crime at a particular level. So, I mean, as we'll see on my pyramid of hair-based deviance, there are certain hair-based forms of deviance that at certain points in history could get you killed. So, it's not always the severe, I'll show you. It's not always the, our perception of the severity of it. It's in that context, how harmful is a particular form of deviance perceived as? And the degree of public agreement. How unified is a society about the harmfulness of this particular thing? All right, in 10 minutes, can I do my silly pyramid of hair-based deviance? And it is super fun because they're all about hair. Okay, so you basically have 4 levels of deviance and how they are punished, right? So you have at the lowest level what's called a social diversion, which mostly meets with confusion and apathy. So if we were looking at today, if you were to dye your hair purple, you are violating a sort of weak social norm. That dyeing your hair purple is a little bit odd. So what would end up happening if you dyed your hair purple or, fluorescent pink, or, if you had hot pink hair? What kind of reaction would you get from people? Well, it's probably pretty minor. Your parents might be like, why did you dye your hair that color? It looks bad. You might have people, that you pass on the street that give you kind of funny looks, but it's seen, in Canadian society today as maybe a little odd to dye your hair purple or pink or whatever it happens to be. But you're going to get, the severity of the social response is very low because it's not a big deal. Society probably doesn't think you're doing a lot of harm. You're just a little bit odd. So it's treated as relatively harmless. There's probably not a lot of agreement. There's low agreement about how harmful it is. So you might get people kind of giving you weird looks. Maybe your grandma makes a funny comment about how silly your hair looks or whatever it happens to be, but there's not a lot of consequences. Okay, so that's social diversion, right? People are like, yeah, odd, and they give you funny looks. Social deviation is one step up. It's still relatively low in terms of the severity of the response. So, I mean, specifically for men, right? Men who wore their hair long and in ponytails in the 1960s were seen as a little bit odd, right? And they were seen as transgressing, a basic social norm that men wore their hair short, women wore their hair long. And so there was a sort of crossing of gender-based norms and boundaries in the 1960s when men had, say, a ponytail. So what would happen, you went to high school, some high schools, not all of them, but some high schools, especially in more conservative places, and maybe you would be called into the principal's office, your parents would have been called, and you would have been maybe sent home and told, when you come back tomorrow, please have an appropriate haircut. And that's all that would have happened, right? It's a little bit more formal. There's probably a little bit more consensus, right? Most of the society would have felt like, yeah, men should have their hair short, but still, it's seen as relatively harmless. And all you get is a sort of minor social reaction, still mostly at the personal level, right? Not a big, deep social reaction. Okay, moving up into the moderately severe, the higher severity, we have what's called a conflict crime. So a conflict crime is going to be, so now we're out of just deviance. we're now into something that is considered a crime. So there is some kind of legal statute against this particular thing. Now, it's a conflict crime because there isn't a total degree of social cohesion about its social harm and about the severity of the response. There's still a little bit of disagreement in this part of the pyramid of silly hair-based social crimes. So if we go back to the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century in Russia, as I know we all want to. This is the time of Peter the Great, Pyotr I, who, amongst other things, wanted to Europeanize Russia and especially its nobility. So one of the things that he did was essentially he made it illegal for nobles to wear, the boyars, the nobles in Russia at the time, to have long beards. This was a kind of traditional Russian look, and the clothing they wore as well. They used to wear these long robes, and he wanted to Europeanize the Russian nobility, so he banned people wearing their beards long, and you could get chucked in prison under Peter the Great, I mean, for almost anything. Peter threw his own son in prison, so he wasn't the, I don't know, cuddliest of people in lots of cases. So, it was a crime. You faced very severe penalties for violating the Tsar's order to wear your beard in the European style and to dress in the style of European nobility. But lots of people still disagreed. So severe social consequences, but the evaluation of social harm isn't completely unified. So still some conflict. That's why it's a conflict crime. Not everybody agrees. And then the last one, it's seen as very harmful in society. Everyone agrees and it receives very severe punishment, is what's called a consensus crime. So when we talk about hair-based examples of a consensus crime, if you go back to medieval Japan, prior to really the Meiji Restoration, one of the things that was very important in Japanese society was a very clear social structure and social hierarchy. And samurais held a particular place. And one of the markers of being a samurai was cutting your hair in a particular way and having a samurai hairstyle. And so only samurais were allowed to have this particular hairstyle. If you were a peasant or someone who wasn't a samurai and you got this particular hairstyle, the punishment was death. You got to die. They decapitated you. Why? Because wearing your hair in the samurai style when you were not a samurai was seen as usurping the whole social order. And that was ultimately seen as putting the whole social order of medieval Japanese society at risk. Right? You were damaging the social order because if you start wearing your hair in the samurai style, no one will know who his samurais are, who the nobles are, and what place you sit, and that's going to put the whole social system in jeopardy. So you got to die for the crime of wearing your hair in the samurai style. Okay, we'll leave my silly hair-based examples. Next time, we'll continue talking about deviance and crime. Okay. Let's close that.